The entire airplane went silent, the usual pre-flight murmur of shuffling and chatter evaporating in an instant. The air grew thick, charged with sudden uncomfortable tension. Every pair of eyes, from the businessman in 3C to the elderly couple across the aisle, snapped toward the front of the first-class cabin. The source of the disruption was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisply pressed navy blue pilot's uniform, his gold epaulets gleaming under the cabin lights. He didn't walk. He stormed in his presence an intrusion of raw, unchecked authority. His voice, when he spoke, was a sharp instrument, cutting through the hushed atmosphere. "Sir," he said, his voice far too loud for the enclosed space. He pointed a rigid finger at a man seated comfortably near the window. The passenger was a black man, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his attention focused on a tablet resting on his lap. The pilot's tone was dripping with a condescending arrogance that made several passengers shift in their plush seats. "You must be in the wrong seat. First class isn't for everyone." A collective, silent gasp seemed to ripple through the cabin. The statement was so blatant, so ugly, it hung in the air, waiting to be challenged. The man in 2A looked up slowly. His eyes, calm and intelligent, met the pilot's stormy gaze. There was no flinch, no sign of intimidation, only a serene composure that seemed to amplify the pilot's aggression. A polite, almost pitying smile touched his lips. "I believe this is my seat," he replied, his voice even and firm. 2A, I have the boarding pass right here." He gestured lightly to the seat back pocket in front of him, but the pilot, a man named Captain Riggs, was too deep in his own prejudice to retreat. He smirked, a cold, dismissive expression, and folded his arms across his chest, a gesture meant to broadcast his ultimate authority. "I don't think so," he reiterated, his voice dropping to a venomous, pseudo-confidential level. "Let's not make a scene, all right? You can move back to economy before boarding is complete. It'll be easier for everyone." The whispers that followed spread like wildfire through dry grass. A woman in 2B, who had been admiring the man's expensive watch moments before, brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide. A few rows back, a young man exchanged a horrified look with his partner. The discomfort was palpable, a physical weight pressing down on the cabin. And then came the phones, sleek rectangles of glass and metal lifted discreetly, their cameras activated, silently documenting the unfolding injustice. The modern-day shield and sword. Captain Riggs, emboldened by the silence he mistook for compliance, took a half-step closer, ready to deliver another ultimatum. He was a man who commanded a multi-million-dollar machine, used to his word being law at 40,000 feet. He never considered that the true authority in this scenario wasn't based on a uniform, but on character. Little did the arrogant pilot know. His life was about to change forever. He was staring not at an out-of-place passenger, but at Dr. Alastair Finch, a renowned constitutional lawyer who had argued before the Supreme Court, a man whose calm demeanor was a well-honed tool in the face of bluster. He was looking at a board member of the very airline he worked for, who was traveling incognito after a private shareholder meeting. In his single misguided act of bigotry, Captain Riggs hadn't just targeted a passenger. He had ignited a firestorm that would cost him his wings, his reputation, and every shred of the respect he so desperately craved. The scene was set and the cameras were rolling. The black man adjusted his glasses, a gesture of such deliberate calm it seemed to slow the very passage of time. The fine Italian wool of his suit sleeve whispered against itself. His eyes, behind the polished lenses, held a depth of patience that felt infinite, a stark contrast to the pilot's brittle aggression. "Captain," he said, his voice so soft the surrounding passengers had to lean in to hear, yet it carried with the clarity of a bell. "I assure you I'm in the right seat. I paid for it." The statement was simple, factual, devoid of the pleading or defiance the pilot seemed to expect. It was a statement of unassailable truth. But Captain Riggs was a man building his own gallows, nail by nail. He let out a short, dismissive puff of air and rolled his eyes, a shockingly juvenile gesture from a man in his position. "I doubt that, sir," he retorted, his voice laden with a condescension that made several people flinch. "Let's be realistic here." The words hung in the air, toxic and unambiguous. There was no more room for interpretation. This wasn't a simple mistake. It was prejudice, naked and raw. The two flight attendants stationed at the galley, who had been frozen in a state of professional horror, exchanged a panicked look. They knew Captain Riggs had a reputation for being a bully, a relic of a bygone era of cockpit autocracy, but this was a catastrophic new low. It was one thing to be rude to a junior crew member. It was another to publicly humiliate a paying passenger based on the color of his skin. Anna, a senior attendant with a kind face now etched with anxiety, found her courage. She took a tentative step forward, her voice a careful, mediating whisper. "Captain, perhaps it would be best if we just checked the digital manifest before we—" "Quiet, Anna." The pilot snapped without even looking at her, his gaze locked on the man in 2A as if he were a problem to be solved. The public reprimand made Anna flinch as if struck. "I know what I'm doing." His dismissal of his crew member fractured the last vestiges of passive observation among the passengers. The murmurs grew from a whisper to a wave of audible discontent. Why is he talking to him like that? A woman in 4B hissed to her husband, her phone now held more steadily, its recording light a tiny, unblinking red eye. He didn't even ask for his boarding pass. A man in 3A declared loudly, no longer trying to hide his outrage. The cabin was no longer a neutral space. It had become a courtroom, and the jury was turning decisively against the man in the uniform. Through it all, the man in seat 2, it remained an island of serenity. He offered a small, almost imperceptible nod of thanks to Anna, acknowledging her attempted intervention. Then, with a sigh that spoke not of defeat, but a profound weariness with having to continually prove his right to exist in certain spaces, he slowly reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. The movement was graceful, deliberate. He produced not a crumpled piece of paper, but a sleek, black alligator skin wallet. From it, he retrieved a crisp, first-class boarding pass and handed it over, his polite smile never wavering. It was a gesture of supreme, unshakable confidence. The pilot snatched the document, his fingers moving with the impatient arrogance of a man about to be vindicated. This was the moment he would expose the imposter, reassert the natural order as he saw it, and shame this man into a retreat to the back of the plane. But the second his eyes scanned the printed information on the ticket, the name, the fare class, the confirmation number, his expression underwent a terrifying transformation. The arrogant smirk melted away, replaced first by confusion, then by a dawning, horrifying comprehension. The blood drained from his face, so completely he looked like a ghost in a pilot's uniform. His jaw went slack. The piece of paper in his hand, which he had grabbed so confidently, now seemed to burn his fingers. He was no longer looking at a boarding pass. He was looking at his own professional obituary. The pilot's eyes, wide with dawning horror, darted from the ticket to the man, then back again, as if hoping the information would rearrange itself into something less catastrophic. Seat 2A, first class, fully paid. Name, Dr. Marcus Thaddeus Bennett. The crisp, printed letters were a death knell to his arrogance. The pilot blinked, the mechanical action doing nothing to clear the stunning disbelief from his face. The bluster vanished, replaced by a flustered, stammering confusion. "Wait, Dr. Bennett?" he managed, his voice a full octave higher, stripped of its former authority. "Yes," the man replied, his calm now feeling less like patience and more like immense, unassailable power. "Dr. Marcus Bennett. I'm on my way to Washington, D.C. to deliver the keynote address at the International Aerospace Safety Conference." A fresh wave of murmurs, louder and more electrified, swept through the cabin. The passengers were no longer just uncomfortable spectators. They were now an audience witnessing a stunning, real-life drama. Phones were held aloft, no longer discreetly, but openly, ensuring every word was captured. A man in a polo shirt a few rows back leaned forward, whispering loudly to his wife, "Wait, the Aerospace Safety Conference? Isn't that like the biggest meeting in the world for flight engineers and aviation experts?" Dr. Bennett's hearing was impeccable. He turned his head slightly, his gaze encompassing the curious passengers, a small, wry smile touching his lips. "That's right," he confirmed, his voice projecting just enough to be heard by all. "It's a gathering of the people who write the rule books, design the simulators, and certify the aircraft. And I designed the flight control system for modern commercial jets. He paused, letting the weight of that statement settle in the thick air. His eyes then returned to the ashen-faced pilot. Including the fly-by-wire system on the Arrow, 500 you're flying today, Captain. The color, what little remained, drained completely from the pilot's face. He looked like a man who had just been told the ground beneath his feet was an illusion. The Arrow 500, this very aircraft, was a marvel of modern engineering, and its flight control system was its neurological center, the very thing that interpreted his commands and kept hundreds of tons of metal safely in the air. This man wasn't just a passenger. He was the architect of the machine Riggs purported to command. You work for Aerodynamics Technologies? The pilot stammered, the name of the industry-leading firm a whisper on his lips. I don't just work there, Dr. Bennett said evenly, his tone devoid of gloating, yet resonating with absolute, crushing finality. He reached into his breast pocket once more, not for his wallet, but for a simple, brushed metal business card holder. He extracted a single card and held it out. I'm the Senior Vice President and Lead Engineer of Flight Systems Architecture. A stunned, profound silence filled the cabin. It was so absolute one could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant whine of a baggage loader outside. The arrogant pilot, who a moment ago tried to publicly humiliate this man, to relegate him to economy based on the color of his skin, had unknowingly insulted one of the very few individuals on the planet whose work made his own job possible. He hadn't just targeted a passenger. He had attempted to demean the intellectual father of the aircraft he was strapping into. The pilot's hand trembled as he took the business card, the thick, embossed stock feeling like a lead weight. He opened his mouth, perhaps to offer some pathetic, stumbling apology, but no sound emerged. He was trapped, exposed not just as a bigot, but as a fool. And just when the pilot, his world already collapsing inward, thought the seismic shock of his humiliation couldn't possibly get worse, it did. A new, commanding voice cut through the silence from the front galley. Captain Riggs, it said, cold and sharp as shattered glass. A word. Now. The head flight attendant, a woman named Clara with steely gray hair and an aura of command that had been forged over 30 years in the sky, moved with purpose. She placed herself between the ashen-faced pilot and the impeccably calm Dr. Bennett, her expression a mask of professional fury. Captain, she said, her voice low but firm, carrying an authority that momentarily cut through the tension. I think it would be best if you stepped outside of the jet bridge. We'll handle the final seating arrangements here. It was a lifeline, a chance for him to retreat from the public spectacle and salvage a shred of dignity in private. But the passengers, now empowered and morally outraged, were not having it. The dam of silent disapproval had broken. No! A woman in 3C declared loudly, her phone held steady. Let him apologize properly. Right here. Another man, his voice shaking with anger, added, we all saw how he treated him. It was disgusting. You don't get to just walk away from that. A chorus of agreement rippled through the cabin. That's right. Apologize. The phones held aloft felt like the unblinking eyes of the world. Captain Riggs was trapped in a digital coliseum of his own making. He could feel his career, his entire life, balancing on the edge of a viral cliff. Forcing his lips into a strained, ghastly approximation of smile, he turned back to Dr. Bennett. My apologies, Dr. Bennett, he stammered, the words tasting like ash. I didn't recognize you. It was the worst kind of non-apology, an admission that his respect was conditional, reserved only for those whose status he deemed worthy. Dr. Bennett tilted his head, his gaze piercing through the pilot's feeble defense. The cabin fell silent again, waiting. When he spoke, his voice was clear, measured, and carried profound, universal truth that landed with the force of a physical blow. You shouldn't need to recognize me to treat me with respect, Captain. The line hit everyone. It was a perfect, elegant summation of the entire ugly incident. It wasn't about a mistaken identity. It was about a fundamental failure of character. A wave of quiet, emphatic applause erupted from the passengers. Not a celebratory roar, but a solid, supportive acknowledgement of justice being spoken to power. The sound was a death knell for Captain Riggs's reputation. His face, already pale, flushed a deep, mortified crimson. muttering something incoherent about pre-flight checks. He turned on his heel and virtually fled the cabin, brushing past a stony-faced Clara. The heavy cabin door hissed shut behind him, sealing him off from the consequences he had unleashed. The flight attendants moved quickly, offering Dr. Bennett a glass of champagne and assuring the passengers that the situation was resolved. But the tension lingered, a thick, electric hum in the air. It was the tension of a story that was far from over. Every person in that cabin knew, with absolute certainty, that the clip they had just recorded would not just be shared with friends. It would become a global talking point. And it did, by the time the plane's wheels touched down in Washington, D.C. The video had already been seen millions of times. Hashtag pilot disrespect and hashtag Dr. Marcus Bennett trended on every major social media platform. The outrage was swift and furious. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a stark example of systemic prejudice. Commentators dissected the pilot's body language, his condescending tone, and the powerful dignity of Dr. Bennett's response. The public demanded accountability, and they demanded it loudly, and justice came faster than anyone expected. Before the airline's corporate public relations team could even draft a milquetoast initial statement, a terse press release was issued directly from the office of the CEO. Captain James Riggs had been immediately suspended, pending a full investigation. But that was just the beginning. By the following morning, a second announcement confirmed he had been terminated. His wings had been publicly and permanently clipped, a direct consequence of the prejudice he had so confidently displayed at 38,000 feet, captured for the world to see. Just 2 days later, as the digital embers of the scandal still glowed hot across the internet, the airline released an official statement. It was a carefully worded document, vetted by a small army of lawyers and PR consultants, but its core message was unequivocal. Global Skyways does not tolerate discriminatory behavior in any form. The captain involved has been relieved of all flight duties and is suspended pending a full and thorough investigation. The public, however, was not satisfied with the suspension. The hashtag fire the pilot began to trend alongside the others, a relentless drumbeat of demand for real consequences. And it didn't stop there. The suspension was not a pause, but a trigger. It opened a floodgate that the company could not ignore. The internal investigation, which might have once been a quiet, internal affair, was now under a microscope, emboldened by the very public nature of the incident. Flight attendants, junior co-pilots, and even ground crew members came forward. They shared records of past complaints that had been brushed aside, a rude remark to a female co-pilot about her capabilities, a sneering dismissal of an economy-class passenger's concern, a pattern of arrogance and belittlement toward his own crew. What had happened in the first-class cabin was not an isolated incident. It was a culmination of a career built on unchecked privilege and a toxic sense of superiority. The evidence was overwhelming and damning. He was fired within the week, his employment terminated for gross misconduct and creating a hostile work environment. Meanwhile, Dr. Marcus Bennett's calm and dignified response in the face of such public humiliation made him an unlikely but powerful online hero. He was not an activist by trade, but an engineer. Yet his quiet authority made him a compelling voice. News channels, from morning talk shows to primetime news specials, invited him to speak. Instead of expressing anger or seeking vengeance, he used every single opportunity as a platform for a profound and simple message. In a calm, steady voice that resonated with millions, he would say, "Respect is no color, no title, and no price tag. It is a currency of human decency that we must all choose to spend freely. The way we treat people, especially when we think no one's watching, that is the moment that defines who we truly are." His word became a mantra. The story, with its clear moral arc, inspired thousands. Teachers shared the video and the quote in classrooms, discussing the importance of character over credentials. Corporate HR departments use it as a central case study in mandatory diversity and ethics training, a real-world example of how bias can cripple a career and how grace under pressure can define a legacy. And then came the final, deeply ironic twist. A few months later, after a top-to-bottom review of its corporate culture, Global Skyways extended a formal invitation to Dr. Bennett. They asked him to consult on the redesign of their entire diversity, equity and inclusion program and to help develop new leadership training for their flight operations staff. It was a stunning request. Many wondered if he would refuse, deeming the organization unworthy of his time. When a reporter asked him if he had accepted the offer, Dr. Bennett offered that same small, knowing smile the passengers in Seat 2A had seen firsthand. "Of course," he said without hesitation. "People can change. Institutions can learn. But for that to happen, lessons must be learned, not just endured." And that is how one arrogant pilot's moment of prejudice, captured in the hushed silence of a first-class cabin, ended up echoing through boardrooms and classrooms around the world. It taught a powerful, universal truth, a truth that no flight manual had ever contained. That no matter your uniform, your title, or your seat on the plane, human decency is the one essential carry-on we all must bring, and it always, always comes first.